Let's talk about redefining and enlarging human rights for the 21st century. Mike Pompeo, Donald Trump's Secretary of State, has been, in many respects, not entirely the face. Donald Trump is obviously the prime face of barbarism and grotesqueness in our world. But Mike Pompeo, as Secretary of State, has been a main agent of a global acceleration of a disregard for human life and human rights. He's the administration's main point person on backing the genocidal Saudi war on Yemen, which has claimed so many lives and engaged in endless atrocities. He's been a coup and warmonger in Venezuela and Iran and countless other areas where this administration has, and let's of course be real and realistic, accelerated and extended U.S. imperial policy and disregard for human rights. And it was just announced in the past couple of weeks that Mike Pompeo will have a new office that will form a human rights advisory council on so-called inalienable rights. This is what Pompeo said announcing the council. Fresh thinking about human rights discourse, where such discourse has departed from our nation's founding principles of natural law and natural rights. And if that sets off your focus that this commission is going to be all about an assault globally on the LGBTQ community and an assault on women's autonomy in terms of their own health care, of course, you're absolutely right. Leading the panel is Mary Ann Glendon. She's a Harvard professor known for her extreme reactionary views on marriage equality, on abortion. There's a broad religious makeup of the panel, and its intentions are clear. Now, Samuel Moyn, who wrote one of the most interesting books of our time, Rights Are Not Enough, has written that actually this council in some ways is an important distillation to track because it's a next step in a formalization of the alliance between the sort of hard right nationalist stance and the religious conservatives as crystallized in this specific argument to narrow human rights. And he and other leftists like Heidi Matthews actually are quite aware that there is a lot of problems and challenges inside traditional human rights frameworks and narratives. We're going to be talking with Daniel Bessner about the horrific legacy of humanitarian intervention, which started from some very noble places, namely wanting to stop atrocities across the world, including in Bosnia and the trauma of the Rwandan genocide. However, our so-called humanitarian interventions, of course, have led to accelerated crises, civilian deaths, and abuses in places like Libya, among many examples. What we need to do, as with so many other challenges and crises of the Trump era, is one, first and foremost, of course, fight against and defend the rights of LGBTQ people and women that are going to be in the center strike of this panel. But more broadly, we can't go back to a discourse of human rights that, as Moyn has documented, has in an extremely disastrous end, has led towards the sort of rhetoric of humanitarian intervention. And also in a more, also a less dramatic, but also profoundly problematic way, led to a sort of amnesty internationalization where, no question, there's important work documenting abuses across the globe, but those abuses are so narrowly defined that they do not encompass a broader understanding of justice and politics. That's as an example among many reasons why Amnesty International has not spoken out on the case of Lula da Silva, or even, in fact, and specifically being very specific, on the actual charges that Julian Assange is facing in the United States. These are serious threats. And more broadly, these groups have not had a discourse on social rights, on labor rights, on the broader material realities of human flourishing. That's a Marxist understanding. It also could be a social democratic understanding of actually enlarging what we mean here. Marxists understood that human rights are nothing but principles on their own. The principle on their did little to protect Eugene Debs, as an example, when he spoke out against World War I. All men were created equal was empty, of course, because of slavery, the second-class citizenship of women, and the genocide of Native Americans. And, of course, the use of so-called human rights to justify interference and imperial adventuring from Venezuela to Iraq to Afghanistan. Human rights need to be structured in a materialist whole that recognizes power asymmetries and broad material needs. The human rights movement has failed to include economic inequality. In large part, it's due because they're afraid of angering wealthy donors, challenging capitalist power structures. We do not need to condemn or abandon human rights. Of course not. We just need to enlarge it. As Samuel Moyn argues, the human rights movement should stick to what it does best, informing our concepts of citizenship and stigmatizing evil, without purporting to stand for the whole of global justice. The whole of global justice is going to deal with what the IMF and the World Bank do to developing countries. It's going to deal with the civilian casualties of imperial actors wherever they act. And it's going to deal with the mass deprivation of people from things, whether it be healthcare, education, or indeed something like the privatization of water that we were discussing last week. While recognizing its limits, human rights creates a baseline to argue for and debate in the legal system, and can we use to highlight contradictions and abuses by the state. This is why the Trump administration is trying to destroy these principles, and why we must loudly oppose them and make the next wave of arguments for an enlarged, materially grounded rights of the 21st century. That's what so many of these arguments go back to. The liberal mindset, the resistance mindset, wants to go back to an order that is dead, an order that has allowed the rise of these monsters that we see, like the Donald Trumps and Mike Pompeos. We need to fight them, protect our allies, protect all human beings, and enlarge and have a real global justice that's fit to purpose for the 21st century. Do you guys have anything to add?
Yeah, I think something that's really important to make clear when we're talking about human rights is that, it's not something that you can just proclaim and there'll be correct action on it. You do need social power and social movements to enact these things. So when we're talking about the American context too, just like liberal rights and all the failures from our Constitution and how it was actually implemented across the country throughout our history, this idea of protecting the minority from the tyranny of the majority wasn't really something that was put into practice, right? But what was put into practice was large social movements, in large part inspired by and using the rhetoric of human rights and liberal rights and saying we need to put this into action and into practice. That really makes a massive difference, which is why what the Trump administration is trying to do by pulling away rights for women and pulling away rights for the LGBTQ community, etc., is really dangerous, because if they're able to do this just symbolically, it only opens up the door for actual material abuses.
Right. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.